Now we are into summarizing the prioritization, implementation, and monitoring progress. Remember, these are the summaries, so you can listen to these and stop if you want, but we will follow up with podcasts in each of these sections with details and toolboxes and metrics, etc. So any plan you make, strategies you need, you have a goal of making yourself less vulnerable to climate change, reducing your risks of climate hazards, and then you have strategies to achieve these goals. You have some tactics to implement the strategy, and then you need to prioritize the implementation, and you need to actually find ways to implement as quickly as required to deal with the task on hand. And then you need really some good ways of monitoring progress so that you are in fact headed in the right direction towards achieving your strategies to meet your goal. So this is kind of a project evaluation type of situation. So this is very important to prioritize, implement, and monitor progress. Lead ministries can be finance, economy, ministry, or agency in charge of climate change, often environmental ministry. US started some different structures within the White House. So there are obviously committees set up by governments to plan national adaptation, mitigation strategies, and so on. To effectively implement and assess these actions, governments must not only prioritize actions to make them compatible with available resources and capacity, they must also establish a robust institutional and legal framework and a consistent system for monitoring progress. This is being played out in the US already. There was a climate fund that was included in the last budget. It got approved, and then implementation is hardly straightforward. And then people who oppose climate action locally begin to make, states begin to punish those who are being proactive about climate action, including corporations who want to be more climate friendly or less climate impactful. And bank collapse happens. The Silicon Valley Bank that collapsed, immediately there were claims that it was due to the so-called environmental, societal, and governance priorities or requirements, compliance requirements. So all kinds of games go on after legal framework is set up as well. The objective is to ensure that all government departments and public agencies adopt and mainstream the adaptation strategy in all their decisions, and that governments continuously monitor and evaluate their impact of their decisions and actions so they can address any challenges and adjust their actions accordingly. Okay, this is hardly trivial, very difficult, but looking at action items to accomplish this: create a strong institutional and legal framework with appropriate stakeholder involvement. This becomes critical. Co-producing the legal framework and the institutional structures is going to increase the probability that stakeholders are going to comply and protect themselves as well. The policy actions discussed in this report require an appropriate institutional and legal framework. Indeed, climate change framework laws can be crucial for formulating short and long-term climate change targets. For example, most climate change framework laws have a knowledge or data component which can help ensure that climate change related information is available to public and private decision makers. Okay, we have looked at a little bit of this in Action 1.1. To ensure that climate change is appropriately addressed, a strong institutional framework is also needed that adapts the mandates of existing ministries, agencies, and institutions, that creates new agencies or committees when necessary, for example, water management agencies at the watershed level, so that you are not only using water for this season or this week, but you are using it with the future adaptation in mind, and that establishes an overarching coordination body to ensure stakeholder involvement at each stage of the adaptation and resilience process, from strategy design to implementation and monitoring. A lot of this is going to be learning by doing. So everything is new, and various top-down and bottom-up efforts are underway with public sectors and private companies also trying to do their bit. But already I have other podcasts showing how corporations are not very transparent, and they are not really as truthful as they claim to be on reducing their emissions and so on. So, or adapting their entire operating system to future climate risks. This is especially critical for banks. Banks are giving out loans that are very risky without considering climate risks and default rates related to that. This is going to affect the entire system. Action 8.2: Design an adaptation and resilience strategy with prioritized actions. Once they have established the appropriate institutional and legal framework, governments can design their adaptation and resilience strategy with precise interventions, investments, and policies. No country has the capacity and resources to implement all possible measures and interventions for increasing resilience. So prioritizing interventions is one of the adaptation strategies and the Finance Ministry's main roles, as this will ensure the efficient use of limited resources. Multiple tools are available for prioritization, from traditional methods for appraising investments to more holistic approaches that account for societal benefits and uncertainty. So look at this in a toolbox. The latter are crucial, as some interventions may not be justified on the basis of pure economics, are essential to protect communities from catastrophic risks. So we cannot continue business as usual. When we have interventions, they may not be justified on the basis of pure economics. So you may have to forego the pure supply, demand, profit kind of paradigm to include these risks, where you are also including the cost of future risks. Okay. Overall prioritization methodologies enable decision makers to identify a concrete subset of interventions that are most likely to deliver large net benefits. So there is this whole adaptation report from the Global Commission on Adaptation. I have podcasts on those, which looks at return on investments in various adaptation strategies like early warning systems. And all the estimates are that by 2050, the return on investment on early warning systems, which we discussed briefly here and I have discussed in other courses, could be 10 times. But does that mean people invest because it will yield high returns later? It's not that simple. You may invest in the stock market with that risk perception, but when it comes to common goods, it's a very different thought process. People begin to discount the future heavily, and they think the future generation will take care of themselves because they will do better than us. So this gets very complicated when you have public assets and infrastructure, etc., that need to be protected for the future by investing now. This is a very difficult situation. Okay, while some of these will target short-term priorities, they should also align with long-term plans and objectives. For example, governments should ensure COVID-19 recovery programs align with the long-term growth objectives. So this was written before all that happened. So COVID came, created a lot of economic slowdown. Then governments provided stimulus funds to revive the economy, or make it recover faster. And a lot of that investment or the stimulus funds, they went into things that are not climate friendly. They were only meant on increasing consumption and consumer confidence, etc. So here long-term growth objectives are not necessarily included when the crisis is on the economy today. So these are complicated issues. So talking about COVID, here is example. We'll end this podcast with this. It's already long enough. So this is Spotlight S.2 COVID-19, a stimulus and recovery package that builds resilience. Remember, this was written before the COVID ended and all the other outcomes, impact of vaccines, impact of lockdowns, travel restrictions on economies was not known. To accelerate recovery once the COVID-19 health emergency is under control, which it is now, according to WHO, the emergency is over. Many governments are planning to introduce massive stimulus packages. In fact, they have been introduced already. These can be improved by considering not only the short-term needs for jobs and economic activity, which is what happened, but also actions to boost the resilience and sustainability of future development paths. This hasn't necessarily happened. Governments can use a sustainability checklist, for example, to screen potential projects, policies, and measures for inclusion in a stimulus package. Checklists should include, already late, short-term questions such as how many jobs will be created over which timeline. Some of this was asked. Long-term questions such as does the intervention enhance the long-term growth potential, for example, by improving the population skill set? Didn't happen, I don't think so. Does it make the economy and population more resilient? In some ways, mostly aimed towards whether vaccines should become regular rather than any concerted pandemic actions in terms of collecting data, sharing data, being ready for the next pandemic, and so on. Does it facilitate the transition to a zero carbon economy and contribute to protecting and building natural capital? I don't think this happened at all. The key objective is to maximize short and long-term gains through a careful selection of interventions. Yes, but let's see how things evolve once we get further away from the pandemic, because we are still in the immediate aftermath of it, so we have to wait and see. So let me stop this podcast here, and then we will come back and look at how using different metrics to measure risk can lead to different priorities for action. So when we talk about prioritization, you're going to depend on risk for the future, and risk is a combination of hazard, exposure, vulnerability, and now even response is added by the IPCC AR6 report. So how you compute risk and what your goal is can actually produce different priorities in terms of adaptation. So we will discuss that when we come back. Okay?